Well, friends, colleagues, wherever you are listening to it, Assalamu alaikum. I'm really, really happy to be giving this webinar today. My talk was postponed twice before, once due to personal reasons and once due to the situation that we have with this COVID-19. But I'm really, really glad that we are able to have it today, because the Flora is complete, and I'd like to very much share this journey of how it all started and what do we have now in terms of the plants or the complete flora of Oman. So my first...
Dr. Shahina, I'm sorry,
Sorry.
there's one practical thing I need to say I should have said to everybody before we started,
Sure.
which is that you've kindly agreed to answer some questions at the end of your lecture. And any people who want to register their questions, please tap the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens, write down your questions, and then Dr. Shahina and I will be able to see them, and I will moderate the Q&A session at the end. Thank you. Okay. I'm sorry about that.
That's fine. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to start with my first slide, which is basically just to get some sort of information to you that Oman has been known to very early travelers. Of course, it was always known for its frankincense and the frankincense that was exported out from southern Oman. But 17th century, early 1835, one of the first people who traveled to Oman was Lieutenant James Willstead, and he traveled with Lieutenant Whitlock. Now, these weren't people who were plant collectors by any means, but what Willstead did was, in his account of the journey, Travels in Arabia, he wrote about the people and the culture of this region. And when, of course, you talk about the culture of a region, a little bit of how they lived, what they ate, and what they wore, what they used for medicine comes into it. So that was really more or less the beginning of how people got to know, or the people in the West got to know about Oman. As I said, Oman has always, and North Africa has been always known for its frankincense and the frankincense trade since a very long time. Carter was one of the first peoples to actually collect the plant, and this was in 1846. And he saw it the first time in Rakhyout near Ras Shajar. He wrote a description of it and got an illustration made from that particular plant. A few years later, in 1864, Klukiger, he identified Carter's plant, which was at that time, it didn't have a scientific name. And he thought it was the same plant as that was found in Ethiopia, the frankincense from Ethiopia, which is Boswellia papyrifera. And he called it, or he treated it as that. But later on, he realized that Boswellia sacra, which is found in Oman, and that is the Omani frankincense tree, is actually a different species. So it was a new species, described as a new species. The type on which the original description is based is actually from Mirbat. It is a plate in the Journal of the Bombay branch of the Royal Asiatic Society in 1847. It was published then. Amongst the actual plant collectors, we have Aucher Elwa. Aucher Elwa was a French collector, and he died in 1838. He was came from a family that wasn't basically anything to do with plants, but he was very fond of plants, and he wanted to collect in the Orient, as for that matter. So he collected in Turkey, Cyprus, Greece, Egypt, the Sinai. He came to Iran, to Syria, and he came to Oman. So his collections were actually the first ones that were known to the Western world. He sold his collections to the Museum of Natural History in Paris, and from there they were distributed out to various other herbaria where there were established botanists to be able to study the plants from this part of the world, which had not been earlier investigated botanically.
Shahina,
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt again. Someone has asked if you can make the slides full screen, which
Okay.
you could do by going to slideshow.
Right. Is that okay?
I think only you can do that.
Yeah, I think it's done.
Yeah, that's better. That's good.
Okay. So
That's done. That's good. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm sorry about that. So apart from that, there was the second came quite soon after that, was Theodore Bent and his wife Mabel, and they came only into the southern part. Osher Elba was only in the northern part of Oman. Bent, who was basically a Kew person, they with Lund, who was the horticulturist in Kew, they came and they made their collections from the Far, the region of the Far, and again collected a couple of new species which were unknown to science at that time. Von Muller collected much later, and his collections were mainly in the Muscat region. He took them back to Berlin, and they were believed to be destroyed during the bombing of Berlin. But there are duplicates present in the British Museum, in Edinburgh, in Kew, in Oxford, and in Paris. Now, Osher Elba, I just want to say a little bit more about him because his collections formed a very basic information that was quite relevant at that time. He arrived in Muscat in 1835 in March, and he took a journey because he wanted to travel to the mountains. And he traveled from Muscat to Sib, Barqa, Nakhal, and people who know Oman would obviously recognize these places and perhaps have been to these places by road, which now exists. From Nakhal, he came to Whitcomb, and then from Whitcomb, it's a very difficult climb because I've done this partly on foot, partly obviously by four-wheel drive and partly by foot, from Whitcomb crossing over into Saik and then descending into Wadi Bani Habib, to Tanuf, Nizwa, Birkat al-Moz, to Iski, through Samail, back to Matra. So this whole journey, he did it on donkey, and on foot, of course, and he kept a very interesting journal about the people he met, the plants that he collected. And I was lucky enough to actually do this walk or do this, his journey. Of course, it didn't take me anything as long as a month. I did it in a day, or because I was in a car. But I was able to locate some of the plants that he had mentioned, collected from Wadi Bani Habib, or from Saik, or from Nakhal. These are very, and some of the plants are still there, which was really quite interesting to see. Anyway, his collections were new to science, and many of them, they were described for the first time by Boissier. Boissier was a Swedish botanist. He wrote a huge 8-volume book on Flora Orientalis, which were basically all the plants from the Orient. And even today, we consider that as one of the major reference works on plants of the Middle Eastern region. Now, as it is a tradition or a requirement, really, when you are describing a new species or a new taxon, you have a generic name and you have a specific name. And Boissier and the other people who looked at Osher's plant collection, they gave the name Muskatense, as it was found in Muscat or around that area, Auscheriana, because it was collected by Osher, and Ausheri also, that was collected by Osher, in basically honoring the collector. So I have photographs of Polygala Muskatense, quite common in the lower hills of the Hajj Mountains. Resida Ausheri, named after Osher. Demidorcus arabicus, which was called Caralluma auscheriana, again in the Hajj Mountains. And Lunicera, which is like a honeysuckle, also named after him. The name of this plant has been changed, but originally when it was described after the collector. Now, when I looked at it, and he wrote in his own journal, he said, to sum up, I have not collected more than 250 species over the whole of the Imamate of Muscat. The local people say that very shortly after rains, which occur once or twice a year, the land is covered with flowers. But who could resign themselves to spending a year in a country where you have to such extreme heat, breathe such air that is almost mortal for Europeans? And he said that I'm convinced that this country, most barren in the world, it would be difficult to find more than 500 species. Well, he wasn't all that wrong, but he was dissatisfied with what he collected in Muscat. I think he was expecting a lot more. And of course, he was a plant collector, but he gained his living from that. And he said, well, you know, poor botanist, he could only get 30 francs per 100 specimens. And later on, his collections were offered for sale at 40 francs per 100 specimens, and they were sent to Geneva, where, of course, they were used by Boissier for his book. Now, later on, in the 20th century, there were other plant collectors, and these were the major plant collectors, which I know all of them, which is really quite lucky, and that their collections basically formed the basis of the Flora of Oman, which I've written, or which I wrote. Popov, no, I didn't know him at all, but I know of him and have read a lot of his papers. Michael Gallagher, I mean, if you know the Natural History Museum in Oman, you would know the name of Michael Gallagher. He was there for a very long time, more than from 73 to 95. I had the pleasure of being and collecting with him on several occasions. And as many of you would know, he was an ornithologist and wrote on the birds of Oman. Michael Gallagher was a very keen collector, although he was not a botanist. He had very good knowledge of where the plants would be found and collected many plants, and always left a set at the Natural History Museum, which is abbreviated as ON. And a set of his also is found in E, which is Edinburgh, at the Herbarium in Edinburgh. James Manteuffel, who was from Saudi Arabia and an Arabist, collected in 72. Then he was also involved with the very early reconnaissance of the Hajj Mountains and Musandam, made very important collections. And also he was able to give vernacular names and to many of the plants, because he was totally fluent in the language, and he was able to collect very important collections from these. Again, his collections are at the British Museum, which I have looked through for many times, and in the Natural History Museum in Oman. Radcliffe Smith was a Kew botanist. He only collected mostly in Dhofar, in the southern region, in 76 and 77. Robert Whitcomb, who is a good friend and a frequent visitor to the Anglo-Omani Society for many of the lectures. He was, I think, doing his PhD at the time and compiled a checklist of plants of northern Oman. He was working on bees, on collecting information on bee plants. His collections were very important, again, for the compilation of the flora. John Edmondson, who was in Edinburgh, collected again in the Dakhliya region and partially the Hajj Mountains. Lawton, who was a forester, collected in 78-79. Collections are at the British Museum. McConaughey, he was Australian. He was, I think, collecting mostly for pastures, as a rangeland species, but he collected, and his collections formed the basis of what is now the Natural History of Oman. And subsequently, a lot of more collections have been added to that. Later on, Miller, excellent collections in both southern and northern Oman. Stanley Price, who was in the Jiddat al-Harasis, started with the reintroduction of the Oryx project. They had their own herbarium. I had the good opportunity to visit there to look at the plants in the central desert, had a small herbarium there. Ian McLeish, he was a veterinary person, but very, very in the far with the Divan. Very good collections, again, mostly present in Edinburgh, and some of them also present at the National Herbarium. Tom Cope, he was a Kew person. No, he's still alive. He is a Kew person, but mainly collected grasses and wrote on the grasses, and also contributed the grass section in my Flora. Faisal Al-Lamki, he was a person later on in the environment of PDO. He worked with Clark and wrote and collected with him and visited all the places to do the first conservation report that was done in 1986. Myself, I collected and established the herbarium at Sultan Qaboos University and also the Sultan Qaboos University Botanic Garden. And my collections are at Belgium, in Oman, at the herbarium in Sultan Qaboos University, and at Kew. And then now we have, of course, the Oman Botanic Garden, and the staff over there. They are excellent. They have been going to all the places and making very important collections. So what is it about Oman that makes it an interesting place as far as plants are concerned? So just looking at, very, very briefly, just looking at the geological history of this region, 34 to 24 million years ago, the Tethys Sea closed, the Arabian-Nubian Shield began to split apart, the Red Sea there was rifting, and the separation of Arabia from Africa happened. And this was quite significant because a lot of the flora which was established in the whole region separated. It was separated by quite a deep Red Sea, and which was a barrier between the exchange of plants. When that happened over, say, 20 million years ago, a lot of the species started to evolve in Arabia, being separated or isolated from Africa. And that makes it a very interesting part of some of the parts, especially in the southern Oman, Yemen, and southern southwest Saudi Arabian flora, is the new species that were formed because of the separation from African. They have a lot of connections, very similar, but they are new. Then, of course, during the Holocene, the sea levels rose, the climate started to warm up, and the deserts formed in some of the area. It was for that reason that Arabia separated again from Iran, which was again there was a barrier again of sea. So looking at the phytogeography, basically something to say what were the influences that we have today on the Arabian Peninsula. Very briefly, the majority of the Arabian Peninsula is influenced by the Saharo-Sindhian region, which is Egypt, Sinai, most of the Arabian Peninsula comes into southern Palestine, Jordan, Israel, and southern Iraq. So that is the major influence. Our flora is major in that way, and it has a lot of common species. One of them, which is photographed over here, Gymerina micrantha, that is only found in the Saharo-Sindhian region. In Oman, we have a little bit effect from the Irano-Turanian region, which is basically the central and eastern Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Israel, and Palestine. It is a very rich region, and the northern part of Oman, some of the Hajj mountain flora is influenced by that. So we find elements of the Irano-Turanian, elements of the Saharo-Sindhian region. So just briefly, these are the three major phytogeographical influences that affect not just the whole of the Arabian Peninsula, but in short, Oman. From the north, Iranian floras, from the south, Somalian and the Sudanian flora, the Saharan Sudanian floras from the east, giving it an area, together with the fact that the separation of the north and the south by the central desert is quite obvious, and that has allowed, it's like an ecological barrier, and the species that are there in the north are unable to migrate or be established in the south. So the northern flora is fairly distinct from the southern flora. So with all this information, this was the background and all the collectors. My first appointment when I came to Sultan Qaboos University was to teach the vascular plants in general, as a general topic in the biology, in the Faculty of Biology in the College of Science. And I realized that to be able to give examples, I did not want to depend upon examples from Britain or from Europe to say, well, this is a grass or that is a plant that I really needed something that was available for my students to go out on a field trip, to have a look at that. The family of the plants was the same, but the examples were so different that I decided to put together a catalog of the vascular plants. So this came out in 1992, published by the National Botanic Garden of Belgium. And as you can see, over a period of time, it was annotated tremendously. So new records were found, corrected names, different species were collected. So over a period of time, a lot of annotations I had to make on the catalog itself. So based on the catalog and from the collections and recent more investigations, field trips, taking my students out and collecting, plus with all the other collectors, in the whole of the Arabian Peninsula, we think, we still do not know exactly, but there may be about 3,500 plants. Saudi Arabia is the richest, then comes Yemen, then comes Oman, UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain. Now, these numbers are not absolute, and they will change with new phylogenetic analyses. Species are always sunk into each other, or they're new species, but approximately that's what we have at the moment. There are about 1.5% in the Oman flora. Those are ferns. These are lower plants. They don't form flowers and they don't have fruits in the same way as angiosperms or flowering plants. The non-flowering plants, which are gymnosperms, juniperus, for example, there are only a few species of that, 2 or 3 species. The major flora is the flowering plants, 98.2%. Endemism, which basically means that these plants are only found, or taxa found only in Oman, nowhere outside in the world. That's about 5%. Range restricted species, these are the plants that are found in neighboring countries, for example, in the UAE or Yemen, or perhaps in Saudi Arabia, but these are restricted to the Arabian Peninsula. And just breaking it, southern Oman has about 800 species, northern Oman about 700. There's a fair amount of overlap, but not a lot. This is basically just the influences on the Oman flora, dividing it further. The upper northern part of Oman, the northern mountains, part of the Wahiba sands is floristically Nubo-Sindian, the ones which is, the Arabian subzone is mostly the eastern part of Oman, and the more African flora, which is also known as the Somalia Masai region, is the Dhofar Mountains and all the way up to the Hukuf and the central part, but only on the very western part, the Hukuf region of Oman. And this we can only gauge by the type of species or the taxa that are found in this area. So what are the species which constitute the Arabian subzone? Where is it coming from? And what are the common species to that? So this is how it is established. So in plant diversity, just now ranging or focusing on Oman, with about 1,300 species and 191 species that are found also in southern Oman, Southeast Yemen, UAE, and northern Oman. There are 3 local centers where the main diversity exists, and that is the northern mountains, the Hajj mountains, both the eastern Hajj and the western Hajj mountains, the central Hukuf region, which is also quite rocky and gets the very lovely fogs during the monsoon time, and then of course the mountains and the northern or some of the areas adjacent to the mountains in the far. I'll take you a little bit to each of the region, just so that I'm sure people who have been over there would be familiar with these species, which are some of the, so right at the top, as you're in the mountains of northern mountains, the Hajj mountains, you get the junipers, which is quite rare. They are only restricted kind of above 2,000 meters. You get the wild olive, and the olive is basically a remnant of when the Arabian Shield and Arabia was joined to Africa. So this is a very old and a relic species, which is now present only in the top of the mountains. The olives are inedible, they're not cultivated or anything, but some of them are fairly bitter, but some of them do have sweet. They're very small, blackish olivers. Sideroxylon muskatense is another species. Boot, it's called, which is one of the common ones found up on the mountains. Then you have Moringa, which is found in Northeast Africa, Southwest Asia. Acredocarpus, again, Northeast Africa and the whole of the Arabian Peninsula. Viola, a very pretty violet, which is mostly found only in northern Oman, and it is also found in Pakistan, in Iran, in Afghanistan, so very much a northern species. And then Commiphora, very much a tropical African species, which is related to myrrh, Commiphora. Now, one of the important species that is found in Oman is Moringa, which is also known as shua. And in the northern mountains, in maybe now ever decreasing, maybe just in 1 or 2 of the villages over there, the seeds the seeds give out, or the oil is extracted from Moringa. It is known as hal al-shua. It is quite a laborious process, but nevertheless, it's the women who do it. They crush the seeds, they knead it, and the little yellow sort of oil. The oil is very good. It is used medicinally for massaging, to be taken in during childbirth, for reducing inflammation, and you can actually buy it. I'm not too sure about now, but I have bought the oil of shua. The Eastern Hajj Mountains are quite interesting because they do have one endemic, which is Ceratonia oreothema. Nowhere else is it found in the whole of Oman. It's found in Yemen, but it's found, again, a relict species because it is stuck right up on the top of the mountains. Everywhere else, if it was present, it's now gone, but these only found at about 1,500 or so, maybe a bit lower, meters on the Eastern Hajj Mountains. The other one is Prunus Arabica, which is, I think it's called Shia. And quite commonly in the Musandam Peninsula, if you look right at the bottom, the local people make axes out of it to cut down the fodder for their goats and cattle. Much of the central or the lower hills are covered with euphorbia and acacia, lycium, marua, and ziziphus. So this is the major, which is fairly common throughout the lower hills and the gravel plains in Oman. The sands, which occupy the central desert areas, 2 or 3 species are very common: Prosopis or Ghaf, Calignum or Artha, and Euphorbia rebeckii, which is only found in the Arabian Peninsula. That is also an endemic over here in Oman. The central or the limestone plateau is quite, again, quite unique because of the fog brings in the moisture, and it has a few species that are quite typical. One of them, Ocradinus harsusuticus, which is named after Jiddat al-Harasis. It is an endemic species only found in the central desert. And a common one is Nanorups, Richiana, or the dwarf palm. And quite commonly used, the leaves of these are shredded, made into these milking bowls, which are, I've shown over here, covered at the base by leather. And they were used fairly commonly. I don't think they may be used now, but they are sold to tourists and in some of the traditional shops in Oman. And these bowls are basically made from the fronds of the dwarf palm. Then we come down to Dhofar, which has a completely different feel altogether. And those of you, of course, know Oman. It is an area where you get the monsoons from August to September, and the whole of the mountains are covered with mist. An endemic species over there is Anogeissus. There is woodland, unlike anywhere else in the rest of the country. And the Anogeissus dhofarica is the main woodland species which covers the mountains and the hills over there on the things. Of course, this is an area where the frankincense tree is also found. And of course, the frankincense tree has been tapped. Frankincense has been moved from Oman to everywhere in the Western world as a popular. There is renewed work on the cultivation of frankincense trees in Dhofar, and the extraction or the tapping of frankincense now. And there was a workshop not very far away into the whole of the frankincense. A lot of work is now being done on frankincense from this region, from the Dhofar region. Also, some of the African plants which are there is Adenium, a very, very beautiful, odd-looking plant with a very fat stem, beautiful pink flowers. Rutia, which is a tropical northeast plant, again, red flowers. Hibanthrus, it's a Somalian influence found in Somalia, Ethiopia, and Yemen. Another regional endemic, Discoresti delii, named after Mike Daly, who was the advisor on conservation for a long time in Oman. And Allodhufarensis, again, a species of aloe thought originally to be endemic to Oman, but then also found in the neighboring Yemen. So these are the species which are either regionally endemic or are found in Africa. Now, one of the things that we did work on while I was in Sultan Qaboos University was to look at the areas where there was a high density or a high diversity of plants. And one of the areas which came up again and again was in Jabal Qamar, the lower Wadi Saik. And it is pretty degraded now, but a few years ago, it's still one of the very few examples of a deciduous dry tropical woodland in Oman. The flora is threatened. It's 5% of it is threatened. It has the highest number of endemic species or regionally endemic species in the country. So with all this information, all the information that was gathered from the looking at herbarium specimens, I started to write the Flora of Oman. The Flora of Oman is now complete, as this talk is all about. The first volume was published in 2003, second in 2007, the third in 2015, and the last one, the final one, in 2018. So it's taken a fairly long time, not necessarily because I was spending all my time writing Flora, but you know, I moved and I was in Kew, so with all my other work, but I kept the Flora of Oman at the level that I wanted to make sure that all the new records or as much knowledge that we have about the flora was incorporated into these volumes. The whole of the flora is published in the Scripta Botanica Belgica series by the National Botanic Garden of Belgium. Now, each volume contains inside the front cover is just basically abbreviations and a transliteration. I have not written anything in Arabic, but the vernacular names are transliterated into from the Arabic. Each volume contains basically a CD, which has the photographs of the flowers in it. And then on the back is basically a map with a grid of, I think it's 100-kilometer grid, showing the basic areas for reference, which I mentioned. For each family that is treated, this is the third volume, the last volume. Each family that is treated, I give a little bit on the bibliography, which is basically the latest work that may have been done on that particular family, just so that people are up to date in their research if they were to look at that particular family. Anything which refers, for example, King in 1988 wrote on a couple of species from Socotra, and I give a reference to that so that it has the basic references of a particular taxon or a family. Then a little bit about the family itself. Each family contains a key so that students or anybody who wants to identify a particular plant, of course, these are technical and you have to be a botanist to be able to do that, or at least some knowledge of botanical nomenclature to be able to do that. But it contains a key to the major genera. And then under each genus is a key to the individual species. And as the individual species are described, if the type specimen on which the initial description is based, that is given. For example, in Phytogeographical Muskatense, it was described by Boissier in 1844 based on a specimen that was collected by Ausher Elwa, and his number is given 5172, and it was collected from Jabal Akhtar range from Muscat. There is a specimen present in Geneva. G signifies Geneva. There's duplicates of that present at the British Museum of Natural History in London and one at Kew. So you can always go back and check if you have the right specimen in hand by looking at the type specimen or the reference specimen from which the original description was done. Then, of course, I give a description of quite a detailed description of the plant. I give the flowering and fruiting time. For example, in this, it flowers February to May, but also sometimes September to October. I give a detailed distribution and habitat, where it is found, its altitudinal range, and where it is endemic to, for example, in this. And if there is anything other than just a description, for example, in this one, the leaves and flower heads have been used in traditional medicine. A very simple thing about that it has been used. I don't go into any details on that, but people can pick it up and can go further into details if they so wish. So this is at the end of the book, there are distribution maps on each species. It's a map, it's a grid map of 100 kilometers, and each dot, each black dot basically shows the presence of that species in a 25-kilometer grid, which is more or less obviously not very accurate, but if you were to go to that point, you would be able to locate the plant. And then a photograph, which is there in the CD that accompanies the book. So the flora is done. So I say, what uses it to anyone? Yes, the flora has been written down. It's a reference item. It's a reference book. What can we do with it now that it is there? So what does the flora give? It gives the identification, a good identification of a particular plant in Oman. It gives its name, it gives its distribution, it gives where it is found, it gives when it flowers and fruits, It gives, if it is related, phylogeny related to any other group, it gives its uses and to allow it gives its conservation status, like, oh, it's rare or it's very common. Now, all this information can be easily fed into databases and it can be used from there. As a flora itself, it may not be useful, but fed into various different databases, it makes each aspect of the flora valuable. So if the plants have a medicinal value, it can go into a database which lists the medicinal and food value. It can be used for forestry in a database on forestry, for agriculture or crop wild relatives, relatives that are related to crops, because they can be used as gene pools for restoration purposes, for horticultural purposes. Some of the plants of Oman are very beautiful. They are not tapped for any horticultural reasons, but they could be brought into horticulture. But very importantly, to preserve the local plant names and their dialects. That is a very important aspect. The flora does give some of the plant names, but it is very important to preserve them. People do forget what are the local names. Preserving the nature, conservation of habitats, ecosystem, and ecoregions. So you could go into a database, bring out all the plants of the northern mountains, and you know that so many plants are there. Maybe 100 years from now, it won't be the same, but you would know how the ecosystem was, and perhaps how to conserve it, how to conserve that particular ecoregion through the database. It can tell you a little bit about climate change. This is all what has been fed. What was there 25 or 30 or 40 years ago? Is it there now? You can revisit the place and find out, and you can do a lot of modeling. This information has already been used in a lot of modeling. Some of the trees and some of the key species on the Hajj mountains, to see what will happen in the next 50 or 70 years time, when the climate will change, will there be lack of rain, or when the aridity will be more. So this data taken from the flora is already in use. Plant identification, this was just about a couple of years ago. The Anglo-Omani Society, in fact, was involved in funding a group of students, both and utilizing the Central Desert, which was it's still a little bit unknown, to collect the plants with the uses, vernacular names. And right in the first photograph, on the kind of left-hand corner, is the flora, which was used for the identification. I was very glad to see that from one of the photographs. And a lot of the information is now present in the Red Data book, which was produced by Annette from the Oman Botanic Garden, which gives the information on the endemic species and those which are vulnerable or threatened in some respect or another, or endangered in some respect or another in Oman, due to development, road building, overgrazing, whatever that is given in that. So also, very quickly, from the flora, this is something that I did as a part of the work on Oman, but expanding it to as much as the whole of the Arabian Peninsula. But a lot of the plants are from this region. Tamarindis Senna, which is used as a laxative, sus or glycerizer used in coughs, chicorum or chicory used for, and these plants are still used in some of the traditional medicine areas and amongst the herbalists in Oman. Cardamus is used for eye infections, sonchus as a coolant, a diuretic, toicrium for many of abdominal pain, salvia for diarrhea, and ocimum or rihan as it's called for colds, pain, and indigestion. So again, this information is present and it can always be expanded upon by looking at the flora, where to get it, what habitat it grows in, when it flowers, if that is needed. So looking at the plant databases, we have in the two major plant bases in the world is Plants of the World Online, which is Kew-based, Plants of the World or World Flora Online is again, a consortium, but mostly I think it's Australia or New York and Missouri Botanic Gardens. So these two main databases take in all the information that is present in the floras and they put them into a very usable. Plants of the World Online is an online database. It is accessible to anybody from anywhere in the world. And I've just taken one example of that, which is a Sideroxylon muscatense, which is a regional endemic in Oman. You can see that it says, it gives its distribution, it gives its photographs, and if there are photographs of it, it will add on to them. A very useful database, but the information comes from the floras that is used in making this Plants of the World Online database. But one of the most important things that happened very recently was the invasion of a very rather invasive species, Parthenium hysterophorus. And it's a serious alien, very invasive species. I recorded it the first time in 1998, just on a roadside in Dhofar. I was just collecting plants and I said, hey, this is a plant I don't know, and identified it. And it was this particular plant. I was there in 2002 in Wadi Darbat, and it had spread to, and was very common right on the top of the area around the pools. 20 years on, I was able to go in 2017, and I confirmed that Parthenium, this particular plant, had spread to an unprecedented areas everywhere where there was a misaffected mountains, the summit plateaus, the wadis, and it can now be considered as a serious. Now, in the lower photo, you can see the person who is actually standing. So it just comes up to almost up to chest height. They are rigorous plants, even though they are annual. It dies down, but then very deep rooted, it comes back again the next day. It's not a serious. It's not well, I mean, I have somebody saying, is it palatable? Because the camels were liking it. But no, it should not be given because it is actually, it makes the milk go bad. It doesn't, the milk of the camel doesn't smell as good. And it is an irritant as well. So it should be known. Anyway, this is a situation at the moment over here. It's basically native to Mexico, and it was brought in. It's a serious pantropical invasive annual. Very luckily, people picked it up. So this species was picked up because it was so invasive. They read, I wrote a small paper on it, and it was read. And very luckily, the people in Dhofar took it on to themselves that it should be eradicated, even if it was to be by hand, because it was not good for the land. It was it's invasive. It takes over the diversity of other species, and it's not good to be eaten by camel. Not at all good for them as well. So quite recently, this was a decree which was made, Decree 189, which was basically to eradicate this invasive. I hope it is successful. It is a difficult plant to eradicate, but with the efforts that are there in place, especially backed by the government and backed by the Dhofari governorate, I really hope that it is successful. So that's all that I have to say. Thank you very much. Just to remind you, for the time that we didn't have internet, we didn't have WhatsApp, and we did use telephone cards, if you remember, for the people who were there in the 70s and early 80s. And these were the cards that were done. These are the paintings of 3 plants that I did and they were placed on the Omani telephone cards. One is, the first one is that of Boswellia, the frankincense tree. The second one is Aloe officinalis. And the third one is the Cretocarpus. These were just 3 plants which are common in both northern and southern Oman, and these were depicted on the telephone cards. So thank you very much. I hope, yeah, I'm able to answer. I hope I haven't gone over the time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shahina. That's really fantastic. We do have a few questions, but only a few minutes in which to answer them. So if I can put them to you, then perhaps I can ask you to give very abbreviated answers, and so that we can cover the ground. Can I begin with one which I'm sure will be of very wide interest to all of our members, which is from Guy Wilkinson. How is climate change posing a threat to Oman's flora? And are there any particular species or areas that you consider especially at risk?
Do you want me to answer that just now?
Yes.
As far as we know, I mean, we don't know exactly what's happening with climate change, but as far as we know, the whole of the Arabian Peninsula is getting more and more arid. So the plants which were growing, say, on the lower hills would no longer be able to survive. And as it was projected in a model that many of the samara, which are basically the tropical African, it goes right up, they will not be able to survive because of the increased aridity. Every plant requires a certain optimum and lower temperature and conditions of rain. And so these areas which will be most affected are possibly the central desert and the lower hills of the northern mountains. As far as we know, things, of course.
Thank you. This is a fairly specialized question, but I'm sure also of general interest. Dr. Shahina, did you ask the local people about the flowering time of each plant and other information, or was this depending on your studies?
It was mostly on the studies, but when a plant is collected, so the flora is basically based on a lot of herbarium specimens, and a herbarium sheet is a plant that was collected at a particular time and at a particular year. So if the flowering was in June, I used that as the flowering time. And if it was just in fruit, I use that as a fruiting time. There is a range, of course, and the range could obviously be changed, but the major, the main, sort of the approximate range is from the herbarium sheets.
Yeah, interesting. And can you tell us what plants are commonly used as fodder in the region? And I guess that will differ from between the north and the south.
Yeah, it differs from region to region. For example, I mean, a lot of the plants are grazed in southern Oman, in the Far region, but in northern, a lot of the plains, again, I mean, if you just have to go, the goats will eat most all plants. They will eat most nymph, booth, olive, most of the plants. And those which are in abundance, those are unpalatable to goats. It's difficult to say exactly, but there's quite a number of species which are grazed by camels, goats, and in southern Oman by cattle.
And there are a couple of questions here which I suppose relate to the Omani actions themselves in Omani institutes and botanical gardens. Terence Ferns says, in 2012, a group of us were in Dhofar with Annette Patzelt. And at that time, the Sultan wanted an example of all indigenous plants in the botanical gardens. How close are you to realizing this aim? And also, we're asked, with all the changes in the climate changes and other changes in habitat, what are the chances of preserving Oman's flora? And do you have information if the competent Omani authorities have a vision or actual steps to preserve biological diversity?
Yes, absolutely. So starting with the last one first, the establishment of the Oman Botanic Garden is there now. It was due to open, but it has been delayed. So the staff of the Oman Botanic Garden, what they have done is that they have collected the seed region by region of all the Omani indigenous plants, all the native plants of Oman. And they have got them growing in the nursery in the Oman Botanic Garden with the view that they will be planted out there, but they also have got a herbarium. And this is basically for the conservation, especially the ones which are endemic and especially the ones which are vulnerable. The seeds and the preservation of the germplasm is in place. And it's a continuing process. So every year, I think every season, they go out to either to the northern mountains or to the far to collect examples and to increase their collections, both of the germplasm and as well as the flora itself.
Yes, I have here a rather specialized question, but since the questioner, Ori Fragman Sapir, put it in really right early, at an early stage in your lecture and comes at the top of my list of questions, I feel honor bound to put it forward to you. Can you say approximately how many Irano-Turanian species occur in North Oman? And is Ixiolirion one of them?
Sorry, which one?
Ixiolirion.
Yes, Ixiolirion is one of them. I would say about at least half of what is found on the northern mountains, which is about 250 or so species, will be found in Baluchistan and in the Iranian mountains.
I'll just have time for a couple more, I think, before we run out. One of them, both of them will allow you to spread yourself, I think, and give us the benefit of your experience. So here's one. As a botanist in Oman, what is your advice for young botanists and researchers?
Oh my goodness! Well, get out, learn. I would say. I think that's the only to love nature. I mean, I think to basically be in and to learn what the plants are there for, not to ignore them. I mean, plants don't move. People like butterflies. People like animals a lot more than people like plants. But plants basically are the basis on which all life basically depends. You know, everything that is moving, animals, insects. So they are very important. And I think taking excursions, now it is so much easier to get to places where you can find the native flora. Get out there, get to know. The books are there, identification guides are there. Get to know the local flora as much as possible.
Thank you very much. And finally, from Robert Whitcomb, who I think is one of your colleagues.
Oh yes, yes.
He says, what do you think is the biggest threat to Oman's flora, which you've partially touched on, but you might like to expand on that a bit. And then finally, do you have a favorite plant habitat you would most like to see preserved in a conservation area in Oman?
Well, the major, as far as I think and have experience of, is development. It's the development that is happening in Oman, building new roads, building, of course, you know, allowing tourism, but unmanaged tourism. I mean, some of the areas have now been declared as nature reserves, but they have to be manned and they have to be strictly adhered to. It's not to preserve the habitats. And I think that is one of the main threats to the plant diversity is development. I say climate change, yes, but there is nothing that one can do as far as climate change is concerned. You can conserve it by other means, by collecting the seeds or the plant themselves for some of the areas, but development has to be managed. My favorite habitat is a very rocky habitat. I'm very fond of the Far, but that's not my favorite habitat. My favorite habitat is the Hajj Mountains, a rocky habitat where the plants it's very bare. The plants are existing in niches, and to be able to know that very particular habitat, a small little loamy soil or underneath a rock, a plant can survive, and it is very interesting for me to look at those special niche and refugia for plant survival and the diversity of plants.
We're going to have to finish, and there are one or two questions still not answered, but we have to give our apologies to the enthusiasts among the audience who have put
Thank you
those
very
questions.
much.
We'll have them
Thank you.
unanswered. Apologies to you, ladies and gentlemen, but to all of you present, thanks for attending, and above all, our thanks to Dr. Shahina.
Thank you.
You know where to get her book. It's from the publishers in Belgium. So thank you very much for, well, all your work over the decades, but for your brilliant lecture this evening. Very illuminating, very helpful, very interesting. Many thanks to you.
Thank you.